There is a place in southwestern Illinois, just east of where the Missouri River meets the Mississippi, where the land rises in unexpected ways. Flat agricultural fields surrounded on every side, broken only by the occasional farmhouse or grain elevator, and then suddenly there it is, a hill that is not a hill. 100 feet tall, covering 14 acres at its base, it sits at the center of a broad, open plain with the presence of something deliberately placed. It is the largest earthen construction in North America, north of Mexico. Its builders had no metal tools. They had no wheels. They moved approximately 22 million cubic feet of earth over a period of roughly 2 centuries using only wooden implements, woven baskets, and human labor organized at a scale that staggers the imagination. The French explorers who passed through this region in the 17th century did not investigate it closely. The Cahokia people, an Illinois-speaking group who happened to be living in the vicinity when Europeans arrived, gave the site the name that stuck, even though the Cahokia people had nothing to do with building it. The original builders had been gone for 300 years by then, and they left no written record, no founding myth that survived to modern times, no inscription on their great mound to say who they were or what they called themselves. They left only the earth they had shaped, and the artifacts embedded within it, and the slow accumulation of scientific analysis that has allowed us, over the past century and a half of archaeology, to begin to understand what was here. What was here was a city, not a village, not a ceremonial center visited seasonally by a dispersed population, but a genuine, densely inhabited, cosmologically organized urban settlement that at its height held a population of at least 20,000 people, possibly more. At the same moment that William, the Conqueror, was crossing the English Channel, and London was a walled city of perhaps 10,000 inhabitants, Cahokia was larger than any urban center north of Mexico. Its influence, measured by the spread of its distinctive ceramic styles and its iconic religious imagery, reached from present-day Wisconsin to Florida, from Nebraska to the Atlantic coast. Copper arrived here from the Great Lakes. Marine shells arrived from the Gulf of Mexico. Exotic chert traveled hundreds of miles to reach Cahokia's workshops, and in return, Cahokia sent its ideas, its art forms, its ceremonial practices, its political model, across the eastern half of a continent. And then it was gone, not destroyed by invaders, not wiped out by a plague we can document with certainty, not buried under volcanic ash or drowned by a rising sea. It was abandoned. Over the course of roughly 2 centuries, from around 1150 CE to 1350 CE, the population of Cahokia dispersed. They moved to smaller towns along the river valleys. They went north into the Illinois Valley, south into the lower Mississippi drainage, east into the prairies. They did not leave a record of why they went, or whether they went reluctantly or with relief. They simply went, and the great mound sat empty on the American bottom, and the fields grew over, and the memory of what had been here faded so thoroughly that when Americans began to settle the region in the early 19th century, many of them refused to believe that indigenous people had built it at all. The story of how Cahokia rose and how it fell is one of the most consequential and least known stories in North American history. Understanding it requires understanding not just the archaeology, the mounds, the artifacts, the pollen records and flood deposits and isotope analyses, but the human logic of urban ambition. What draws people together into cities? What cities demand from their surrounding environments, and what happens when those demands cannot be sustained? The American bottom is one of the most productive agricultural landscapes in North America. It is a broad floodplain created by millennia of Mississippi River flooding, built up layer by layer with the alluvial sediment that the river carried down from the continent's interior. The soil is deep and rich. The bottomland lakes and oxbow channels that dot the floodplains support enormous populations of fish, waterfowl, and mussels. White-tailed deer are abundant in the surrounding upland forests. For the maize farmers of the late woodland period, the people who occupied this landscape from roughly 700 CE to 1050 CE, the American bottom was a place of relative abundance. They farmed the rich bottomland soils, fished the lakes, hunted the deer, and lived in dispersed villages scattered across the floodplain. What they did not do, and what is so striking in retrospect, is build cities. The late woodland villages of the American bottom were small, flexible, seasonally mobile in some respects. There were mounds, but they were modest by later standards, burial mounds, not platform mounds designed to support permanent elite architecture. The social organization was roughly egalitarian. The material culture, while sophisticated, shows no evidence of the kind of ranked, hierarchical society that city building typically requires. These were communities organized around kinship networks and seasonal resources. They were skilled. They were resilient. They were adapted to their landscape in the way that generations of careful observation and accumulated knowledge make possible. But they were not building cities, and there is nothing in their material record to suggest that city building was on the horizon. And then, around 1050 CE, everything changed. Archaeologists call it the Cahokia Big Bang, and the name is apt in ways that go beyond metaphor. The stratigraphic record at the core of the Cahokia site shows no gradual urban buildup, no smooth transition from village to town to city across the archaeological layers. There is the late woodland occupation, and then, within what appears to be a single generation, perhaps 30 or 40 years, there is a city. The Great Mound is begun. The Grand Plaza, a leveled ceremonial space of roughly 50 acres directly in front of the mound, is created, which means an enormous amount of earth was moved not to build upward, but to scrape the existing surface flat and fill the depressions to create a perfectly level ceremonial ground. Hundreds of structures appear in the surrounding area. The population appears to have jumped from a few hundred to 10,000 or more within decades. What caused this? The honest answer is that we do not fully know, and the uncertainty is itself significant. Timothy Paucatat of the University of Illinois, the leading scholar of Cahokia, argues that the Big Bang was not simply the result of population growth or gradual social evolution, the kind of incremental urbanization that produces many of the world's ancient cities. He suggests it was the product of a genuine religious and political revolution, possibly centered on a charismatic founding leader or set of leaders who reorganized the landscape around a new cosmological vision. The speed and scale of the transformation, the cosmological precision of the city plan with its careful alignment to solar events, the precise geometry of the Grand Plaza, and the evidence of mass feasting events in the archaeological record, the remains of enormous communal gatherings, with hundreds of deer and other animals consumed in what appear to be founding celebrations, all suggest a moment of concentrated collective will. This is not simply scholarly speculation. In chiefdom-scale societies, the organizational type that best describes what Cahokia represented, urban transformations of this kind are typically associated with a founding event that has both practical and mythological dimensions. A moment when a new cosmological claim is made, a new political arrangement is proposed, and a large number of people decide, for a complex mixture of reasons including genuine belief, social pressure, and material incentive, to participate in building something new. The founding feasts that Paucatat and his colleagues have identified in the archaeological record are consistent with exactly this kind of mobilizing event, a gathering of people from hundreds of miles away to witness and participate in the creation of a new center of the world. The city that resulted was organized around an axis of power and cosmology. Monk's Mound sits at the north of the Grand Plaza. Its successive construction phases, built up over roughly 2 centuries, eventually reached a height of approximately 100 feet, making its summit the highest point on the American bottom for miles in every direction. The mound was built in stages, a central core of packed earth, then successive additions that widened and raised it, each addition requiring the coordination of enormous labor forces working in relay. At intervals in the construction sequence, the mound builders paused and created terraces, apparently for construction of wooden structures that have since completely decayed. The central mound alone required more human effort than was expended on many of the greatest construction projects of the medieval European world. Standing on the summit of Monk's Mound, you could see the entire city spread below you, the smaller platform mounds, the residential districts, the stockade wall, the plazas, and the sweep of the Mississippi Valley beyond. Whether the summit held a wooden temple, a chief's residence, or a ceremonial platform, we cannot say for certain. The wooden structures have long since decayed and left only post holes and debris layers, but the architectural logic is clear. Whoever occupied the top of that mound occupied the physical center of the world as Cahokia's inhabitants understood it. The city's layout encoded cosmological meaning at every scale. The Grand Plaza was aligned approximately to the cardinal directions, with Monk's Mound anchoring its northern edge. The platform mounds that ringed the plaza were distributed in a pattern that modern surveys have shown to be deliberately planned rather than organically accumulated. They were placed according to a geometric scheme that encoded the same solar and directional relationships that the Woodhenge post circles encoded at a larger scale. To walk through Cahokia at its height was to move through a landscape that was simultaneously a city and a diagram of the cosmos. The Woodhenge itself, a series of large circles of cedar post holes west of Monk's Mound, was an astronomical observatory of considerable sophistication. These circles, some containing posts several feet in diameter and over 20 feet tall, enabled the observation and prediction of solar and lunar events. The largest circle's central post aligned with the sunrise over the summit of Monk's Mound at the spring equinox, physically encoding the relationship between the sun, the great mound, and the political authority of whoever occupied the mound's summit. Other posts in the same circle marked the summer and winter solstices and the positions of the moon at its major standstills. The Woodhenge was not built once and maintained unchanged. It was built and rebuilt and expanded at least 5 times over the city's history, each reconstruction apparently recalibrating the astronomical alignments as the city's ceremonial needs evolved. A priestly class or an astronomical specialist class must have maintained this knowledge across generations, passing it through an oral and observational tradition that has not survived in any recoverable form. What this tells us is that Cahokia's political authority was not simply material, it was cosmic. The leaders who inhabited the summit of Monk's Mound were not merely chiefs distributing goods from a central warehouse, not simply administrators managing a redistribution economy. They were mediators between the human world and the celestial order, the people whose ceremonies made the sun rise on schedule at the correct place on the horizon, whose rituals renewed the agricultural cycle, whose authority derived from their demonstrated mastery of the forces that governed life and death and the turning of the seasons. In a society without writing, without formal state institutions, without a bureaucracy or a standing army in any recognizable sense, cosmological authority is real authority. The ability to predict a solstice and stage a ceremony at the precise moment the sun struck the correct alignment, the ability to distribute rare and beautiful objects that came from impossibly distant places, the copper plate from Lake Superior, the shell cup from the Gulf Shore, the finely worked chert tool from a quarry 300 miles away. These were the mechanisms of power. They demonstrated in physical and visible form that the Cahokia elite had access to resources and knowledge that ordinary people did not, and that this access was in some sense cosmologically sanctioned, connected to the forces that governed the world. The power was real. The evidence from Mound 72, a small ridge-top mound at the southern periphery of the city, makes this clear with a force that is difficult to absorb. Mound 72 was excavated by archaeologist Melvin Fowler in the 1960 and 1970, and what he found beneath it remains among the most extraordinary and disturbing archaeological discoveries in North American history. At the base of the mound, Fowler's team found the burial of a high-status individual, almost certainly a male of some political or religious significance, laid out on a platform of approximately 20,000 marine shell beads arranged in the shape of a falcon or bird figure. The shell beads had been brought from the Gulf of Mexico, hundreds of miles away. The number of beads involved, 20,000, represents an investment of labor and long-distance trade that only a very powerful social authority could have commanded. The figure those beads depicted is the birdman, or a figure associated with the birdman iconography, one of the central cosmological icons of the Mississippian religious world, a falcon-headed warrior associated with warfare, sacrifice, and the cycle of death and renewal. The man buried on this platform of shells was being identified with, or was claiming to be, this figure. His death was a cosmic event, not merely a personal one. Around this central burial, over a period that appears to span multiple ceremonial events, were deposited the remains of more than 250 other people. Most were young women. In one pit, 53 young women had been placed in neat rows. In other pits, individuals were deposited in various arrangements. Physical anthropologists who have studied the remains have found evidence of some individuals being killed just before burial, of some arriving at the burial site already in a state of decomposition, of some showing signs of restraint or constraint in their final positioning. The word archaeologists use carefully is sacrifice. The scale is what silences you. This was not the burial of a retinue of willing companions following their chief into the afterlife in a single ceremony. It was an organized, extended, ceremonially sophisticated operation involving the coordination of dozens of people and resources from across the city, and possibly from outside it, conducted over multiple events, all in service of defining and memorializing a single individual's cosmic authority. The political authority required to command that kind of resource, human as well as material, is authority of a very particular kind. It is the authority of a society that has moved well beyond the egalitarian reciprocity of the late woodland villages and into something that more closely resembles, in its organizational logic if not in its specific cultural form, the state-level societies that were building pyramids in Mexico and temple complexes in Southeast Asia in the same period. Cahokia at its height was not a large village with a ceremonial mound. It was an urban civilization in the full sense of that word, hierarchical, cosmologically organized, economically redistributive, and politically coercive in ways that small-scale societies are not. That ambition had a cost. The cost began to accumulate from the moment the city was built, and it accumulated in the one place that the city's cosmological authority could not reach: the landscape. The first dimension of the ecological cost was timber. Building Monk's Mound required enormous quantities of wood, not just for the structures on its summit, but for the wooden retaining walls, log cribs, and interior support structures that held the mound's earthen mass in shape during and after construction. Building the stockade that enclosed the central precinct required enormous quantities of timber. The main stockade was approximately 2 miles in circumference and used posts estimated at about 20,000 individual trees per construction phase. The stockade was rebuilt at least 4 times, meaning that across the city's history, perhaps 80,000 mature trees were consumed in fortification alone. Heating the city through Midwestern winters, winters that were colder in the medieval period than today, required an unrelenting flow of fuel wood. Cooking for a population of tens of thousands, day after day through every season, demanded more. The ceramic kilns, the food processing operations, the communal feasts that were the city's social glue, all of these consumed wood at a rate that the surrounding landscape could not sustain indefinitely. The upland forests surrounding Cahokia had been relatively intact at the beginning of the late woodland period. Pollen cores taken from sediments in lakes near the site tell a story of progressive and accelerating destruction. Arboreal pollen, the biological signature of living forest, declines sharply in the cores beginning in the 11th century and continuing through the 12th and 13th. In its place come the pollens of grasses, weedy plants, and disturbed ground agricultural indicators. The forests were being cleared faster than they could regenerate, and what replaced them was not simply farmland but degraded scrubland, the eroded residue of hillsides stripped of the root systems that had held their soil in place for centuries. The consequences of that deforestation rippled through the city's ecology in multiple directions simultaneously. Topsoil eroded from the cleared uplands and washed into the waterways of the American bottom. The secondary channels and oxbow lakes that the city's inhabitants had relied on for fish, mussels, and waterfowl began to silt up with accumulated sediment. The fishing and foraging resources that had supplemented the agricultural diet during Cahokia's early decades contracted as the wetland habitats they depended on filled in and disappeared. Simultaneously, the agricultural productivity of the bottomland fields was being affected by altered drainage patterns, waterlogged soils, where channels had silted shut, drier soils, where the water table was dropping in areas that had previously held moisture through the summer growing season. The ecological system that had made the American bottom exceptional was being systematically degraded by the demands of the city that had grown up on it. Deforestation also increased the vulnerability to flooding. Forest cover on hillsides absorbs rainfall slowly through deep root systems. Cleared hillsides shed it rapidly and directly into waterways. The runoff from Cahokia's denuded uplands was adding to the flood pulse of every tributary stream that fed into the Mississippi. And the Mississippi River in the 12th and 13th centuries needed no encouragement to demonstrate its capacity for destruction. The paleoclimate record for the American bottom preserves this history in thick layers of sediment deposited by flood events, whose scale can be read in the character and thickness of the deposits. Researchers have studied these deposits in cores from Horseshoe Lake, an oxbow lake lying immediately adjacent to the main Cahokia site, and the evidence is unambiguous. Beginning in the late 12th century and continuing into the 13th century, a series of major flood events struck the American bottom with a frequency and magnitude that exceeded anything in the preceding centuries. These were not the routine seasonal floods that an agricultural society living on a productive floodplain learns to manage and plan around. These were extraordinary inundations, events that deposited feet of silt across agricultural fields, that overwhelmed the drainage systems that Cahokia's inhabitants had developed to manage seasonal water, that inundated residential areas and destroyed stored grain, and left the city's population dependent on whatever reserve supplies the elite could redistribute from the central stores. A society can absorb one catastrophic flood if its reserve stocks are sufficient and its organizational authority is strong enough to manage the recovery and prevent the panic that food insecurity generates. It can perhaps absorb 2 or 3, spaced over decades, as long as the intervals of recovery are long enough to rebuild the stored surplus. What it cannot easily survive is a sustained pattern of major flooding concentrated over a period of decades. A pattern that destroys harvest after harvest, depletes the stored surpluses that represent the only buffer between the population and starvation, and places unrelenting stress on the political relationships that hold the community together. This is precisely the pattern the geological record shows. The flood events of the late 12th and early 13th centuries were not spaced far enough apart for full agricultural recovery between them. The accumulated effect was not simply damage. It was the progressive erosion of the margin of security that had made Cahokia's urban experiment possible. Stored grain that could absorb 1 year of poor harvest could not absorb 3 or 4. Agricultural fields that had been productive for generations were covered in silt that would take years to clear. The wetland resources that had supplemented the agricultural diet were already degraded by sedimentation. The city's population, which had grown in the expectation of continued abundance, was now living in a landscape that could no longer provide it. The relationship between Cahokia's elite and its subject population had been built on a particular and specific form of legitimacy. The elite organized the ceremonies that aligned the community with the cosmic order. They managed the redistribution of exotic goods, the copper, the shells, the high-quality stone tools that gave the social hierarchy its material expression. They maintained the astronomical knowledge that allowed the planting and harvest calendar to be managed correctly. They staged the great communal feasts that were simultaneously celebrations of surplus and public displays of the elite's ability to command and distribute that surplus. In return, the population built mounds, contributed labor to public works, provided tribute in agricultural goods, and participated in the social order the elite defined. This is a functional arrangement in conditions of reasonable plenty, conditions in which the elite can actually deliver on its implicit promise to manage the community's relationship with the forces that govern agricultural abundance. In conditions of sustained flood-driven crop failure, it becomes a different kind of arrangement entirely. The ceremonies are still staged. The astronomical alignments are still observed, but the harvest still fails. The river still floods. The stored grain still runs short before the next harvest. And in a hungry population, the questions that begin to circulate are precisely the questions that cosmological authority is least equipped to answer. If the ceremonies that were supposed to ensure agricultural abundance have not ensured it, if the elites claim to mediate between the human world and the natural forces that govern it has been visibly falsified by a generation of floods and bad harvests, why continue to build mounds? Why continue to provide labor and tribute? Why remain in a city that demands much and delivers far less than it once promised? The Palisade evidence suggests that someone understood, at some point in Cahokia's later history, that those questions were being asked. The reconstruction of the central precinct's wooden wall into a progressively stronger, more sophisticated fortification, with bastions projecting from its face at regular intervals to allow defenders to fire along the wall from multiple angles, eliminating the blind spots that a simple linear wall creates, is the kind of architectural investment that only makes sense if there is a real and perceived threat from a population that might need to be controlled. Whether that threat came from outside the city entirely, from rival towns in the broader hinterland, from displaced populations pressing on the city's diminished resources, or from inside it, from the city's own population becoming ungovernable under conditions of increasing scarcity, the archaeology cannot tell us with certainty. But the Palisade speaks. It says that the people who commanded the central precinct were no longer confident that their authority would hold without a wall. There are other hints of political disintegration in the later archaeological record. Some residential areas in Cahokia's peripheral zones show evidence of burning and disruption. The production of the distinctive fine ceramics that had been one of Cahokia's material signatures, the vessels decorated with southeastern ceremonial complex iconography that showed the bird warrior figures and the swirling cosmological designs of the Mississippian religious world, declines. The markers of cultural coherence fade. What had been a unified material culture begins to show signs of fragmentation into local variations, as if the centralizing force that had held the aesthetic and ideological world of Cahokia together was losing its grip. Isotope analysis of human remains from Cahokia and surrounding sites adds another layer to this portrait of decline. The strontium and oxygen isotopes preserved in bone and tooth, enamel, carry geochemical signatures of the local geology and water that a person consumed during childhood. By comparing the isotopic signatures of skeletal remains from Cahokia with the baseline signatures of different regions, researchers can identify individuals who grew up in the immediate Cahokia area and those who came from elsewhere. In Cahokia's early, ascendant phase, a significant proportion of the adults in the archaeological record grew up far away. The city was drawing people in. The gravitational pull of its ceremonies, its trade goods, its political promise was strong enough to pull families across hundreds of miles of continent and plant them in a new urban landscape. The reversal of that pattern is as meaningful as any other single signal of decline. As the flood layers accumulate in the geological record, and the pollen record shows the progressive depletion of forest cover, the evidence for in-migration fades. The city that had once functioned as a continental magnet is no longer drawing people. The exotic goods that had marked Cahokia's redistribution network stop appearing in new contexts. The long-distance contacts that had connected Cahokia to copper sources in the Great Lakes and shell sources on the Gulf Coast contract, and eventually disappear from the material record. The elite's ability to redistribute the kind of rare, beautiful, cosmologically charged objects that had validated their authority in the eyes of the population is diminished, then ended. The abandonment itself was not a single event. This is important to understand because the way that cities end tells us something about the nature of the force that was holding them together. Cahokia did not end in a final battle, a last-stand defense of Monk's Mound, a fire that left a destruction layer across the site. It ended incrementally, unevenly, from the outside in. The outlying mound centers in Cahokia's hinterland. The subsidiary towns that had participated in Cahokia's political and ceremonial network, sent tribute and received redistribution, aligned their own ceremonial cycles to the calendar that Monk's Mound defined, show signs of reduced activity and eventual abandonment before the urban core. The peripheral communities, furthest from both the city's concentrated resources and its coercive mechanisms, were the first to leave. Then the intermediate zones. Then, finally, the core. The last inhabitants of the precinct around Monk's Mound were probably a remnant of whatever political and priestly class had managed the city's ceremonies, until there was no longer a population large enough to make the ceremonies meaningful. At some point in the mid-14th century, even they were gone. What A.J. White and colleagues found in sediment cores from the Mound 34 area, published in 2020, provides one of the most unsettling possible close-ups of this process. Preserved in the sediments were fecal stanols, organic compounds produced by gut bacteria that, in sufficient concentration, indicate the presence of large human populations. The stanols show a sharp decline corresponding to one of the major flood events, consistent with a sudden, flood-driven loss of population. The same study recovered possible evidence consistent with a pathogenic organism, though this finding is contested, and the specific pathogen identification has not been universally accepted. Whether Cahokia suffered a plague or not, the stanols make the population decline visible at the level of individual sediment layers. People left. They left quickly enough to register as a discontinuity in the biological record. By 1350 C, Monk's Mound stood empty. The stockade had not been rebuilt after its last deterioration. The workshops that had once processed exotic trade goods had gone silent. The wood hinge posts, which had required regular maintenance and periodic replacement to remain structurally sound, had rotted and fallen. The Grand Plaza, which had once been the gathering place for tens of thousands of people during the great seasonal ceremonies that Cahokia staged to mark the solstices and equinoxes, was being reclaimed by the vegetation that had been pushed back for 3 centuries. The city was over. The people who had lived there were not dead. They were dispersed, and the communities they moved to were real and continuing communities with their own histories. Some had moved south along the Mississippi toward communities in the lower river valley and the southeastern cultural zone. Some had moved north along the Illinois River. Some had joined smaller towns in the broader Mississippian cultural network, towns that continued to build platform mounds, continued to practice the southeastern ceremonial complex religious traditions, continued to organize their communities around versions of the cosmological authority system that Cahokia had developed, tested, and ultimately exhausted at the continent scale. The Mississippian culture did not end when Cahokia ended. It continued to develop and transform across the southeastern United States for another 2 to 3 centuries, producing impressive centers: Moundville in Alabama, Etowah in Georgia, Spiro in Oklahoma, before the catastrophic disruption of European contact in the 16th century reshaped the entire landscape of Native American civilization. What ended when Cahokia ended was not a people or a civilization in the broadest sense. What ended was the specific, extraordinary, and in retrospect precarious concentration of people, resources, and cosmological ambition that had made Cahokia, for a century and a half, the dominant center of North American civilization north of Mexico. That kind of concentration has a logic of its own, and part of that logic is the possibility of sudden failure when the conditions that made it possible change faster than the human institutions managing it can adapt. When Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet paddled down the Illinois River, and then the Mississippi in 1673, they traveled through a landscape inhabited by indigenous peoples, by Illinois Confederacy nations, by various groups along the river valleys, but they found no city. The mounds were there. Marquette's journal notes unusual hills along the river, but he did not investigate them as the ruins of an urban civilization, because no one he encountered connected those earthen hills to a recent urban past. The connection between the earthworks and their builders had been severed by 3 centuries of dispersal, demographic disruption, and the erosion of the oral traditions that might have preserved the memory of what Cahokia had been. It was not until the sustained archaeological investigation of the 20th century, and particularly the work of researchers like Warren Witry, Melvin Fowler, and Timothy Pawcatat, that the scale of Cahokia's achievement became visible to the world outside of indigenous oral tradition. There is a particular kind of tragedy in the gap between what Cahokia was and how thoroughly it was forgotten, even by the people of the region where it stood. Partly that forgetting was the result of the specific colonial mythology that surrounded the mounds for much of the 19th century. The insistence by many American settlers and early archaeologists that such impressive constructions could not possibly have been built by the indigenous people of the continent, that they must represent a lost civilization of higher cultural origin, a vanished race of superior people who were later displaced by the ancestors of contemporary Native Americans. This mound builder myth was not simply wrong. It was deployed as a political argument for the dispossession of indigenous peoples, a way of claiming that the North American continent had no legitimate prior ownership by the peoples who were being removed from it. The myth was thoroughly debunked by the end of the 19th century, but its shadow lay over popular understanding of Cahokia for decades after. What the archaeological record actually shows is something far more interesting than a lost race. It shows a people fully capable of the ambition, organization, cosmological vision, and political sophistication that city building requires, who built a city and sustained it for generations, and then confronted the limits of what their environment and their political structures could support. They did not fail to create a city because they lacked some quality that city building requires. They created a city. The mounds are the irrefutable evidence of what they were capable of. The abandonment is the record of what they encountered when capability met the compounding pressure of ecological degradation, climate disruption, and the structural instabilities of a hierarchical political system under resource stress. No single decision made Cahokia fail. There is no moment in the archaeological record that functions as a turning point. No single flood that decided everything. No coup or assassination that ended the political order in a day. No disease event that carried off the population in a season. The failure was accumulated, layered, the product of thousands of individual decisions made in response to deteriorating conditions that no individual could fully see or fully manage. The deforestation was the result of thousands of reasonable individual decisions to cut wood for fuel and building materials. The flooding was not Cahokia's fault. The Mississippi had been flooding the American bottom for millennia and would continue to do so long after the last Cahokian left. The political tensions that may have produced the stockade, and perhaps the internal conflict of the later period, were the natural product of a hierarchical society under resource stress. The tensions that produce instability in every complex society that faces the same conditions, from the ancient Near East to medieval Europe to the modern world. What Cahokia reveals is not a peculiar failure unique to a particular culture at a particular time. What it reveals is the common logic of urban limitation, that cities are sustainable only so long as the relationship between what they consume and what their environment can provide remains in balance, that the forces driving urban concentration, the cosmological authority, the redistribution of exotic goods, the social magnetism of a great center, can maintain that balance against ecological and climatic pressure for a while, sometimes for a long while, but not indefinitely, and that when the balance tips, the process of correction is rarely managed and controlled. It is typically experienced as collapse. The mounds survive. Monk's Mound is still there, still the highest point on the American bottom, still visible for miles across the flat Illinois plain. It has been a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1982. Archaeologists are still excavating, still refining the chronology, still extracting new evidence from the sediment cores and the isotope analyses and the pollen records. Each year the picture of what Cahokia was becomes more detailed, more specific, more human in the sense of being traceable to individual decisions and individual lives rather than to anonymous cultural forces. The descendants of the people who built Cahokia are also still here. The Osage Nation, the Quapaw Nation, the Chickasaw Nation, and many other indigenous nations of the Midwest and Southeast trace their ancestry to the broader Mississippian cultural world of which Cahokia was the most spectacular expression. Their oral traditions carry fragments of knowledge about the mound-building period that archaeological evidence alone cannot recover, memories of the great ceremonies, the social meanings of specific mound forms, the cosmological principles that organize the city. The story of Cahokia is not a story about a civilization that disappeared without trace or without descendants. It is a story about a civilization that transformed, that dispersed its people and its ideas across a continent, and whose descendants carry that inheritance in their communities and their traditions today. What vanished at Cahokia was not a people. It was a particular form of urban concentration that required specific conditions to exist, and that ended when those conditions could no longer be sustained. It was an experiment in organized complexity, conducted on a scale and with a degree of ambition that still commands astonishment when you stand at the base of Monk's Mound and look up at the earthen slope rising above you, and try to understand what it would have meant, in the 11th century, to move this much earth this deliberately in a place where no city had ever existed before, whatever they called themselves, and we do not know, because no written record tells us. They built something extraordinary. They built it in one of the most productive landscapes in North America. They organized it around a cosmological vision of stunning intellectual sophistication, and they sustained it through the labor of generations. And when it became clear, through flood and famine, and the slow erosion of the political order that had held everything together, that the city could no longer be sustained, the people who had built it and lived in it made the only rational choice available to them. They left. They carried their knowledge, their religious practices, their social structures, and their genetic heritage into the broader world of Mississippian civilization and into the communities that would become the nations of the American Southeast and Midwest. The city ceased to exist. The people who had made it did not. Cahokia is gone. The civilization it represented is not forgotten. And the earthen mound that defines the skyline of the American bottom is still there, patient, enormous, and without any inscription to tell you what it is, waiting for the questions that are the only form of attention we have left to give it.